After driving up to my own home from a medical appointment, I found hundreds of filthy tires blocking my only access road. That nightmare became my reality when our power-hungry HOA president decided I needed to be taught a lesson for questioning her authority. She thought she was untouchable, and she might have been if she'd bothered to check who my family was. What would you do when someone literally imprisons you on your own property? All because they can't stand being challenged. After 34 years running my own construction company, I finally bought my dream property, a 15-acre farm just outside city limits with perfect southern exposure for my workshop. The views were breathtaking, the air clean, and I finally had space to restore classic cars, my lifelong passion. The property had just one quirk. While my land was outside HOA jurisdiction, my quarter-mile driveway connected through Pine Creek Estates. I'd done my due diligence before purchasing, confirming I only needed to pay a modest road maintenance fee while my actual property remained independent. The HOA president at the time, a reasonable man named Frank, assured me in writing that my property wouldn't be subject to their architectural guidelines or landscape restrictions. For 5 years, everything was perfect. I maintained my section of road meticulously, even helping neighbors during heavy snowfalls with my tractor. I built good relationships with most Pine Creek residents, who appreciated having someone with construction experience nearby whenever they needed advice on home repairs or renovations. Many neighbors became friends, often stopping by to admire my latest restoration project. I even restored old Mr. Wilson's '57 Chevy as a surprise for his 80th birthday, which earned me a standing ovation at the community potluck. The previous HOA board operated sensibly, focusing on actual community needs rather than micromanaging residents. They respected property rights and understood that reasonable compromises built stronger communities than rigid rule enforcement. I'd always been the type to keep my head down and mind my own business. At 62, after decades of hard physical work, I just wanted to enjoy my retirement in peace. My wife had passed away 3 years earlier, and working with my hands on these restoration projects was therapeutic. The last thing I wanted was conflict with neighbors or bureaucratic battles with an HOA. Unfortunately, that peaceful existence was about to be shattered by someone who saw my independence as a personal affront to her authority. Everything changed last spring when Patricia Harmon campaigned for HOA president on a platform of neighborhood beautification and property value protection. A former corporate executive with no community leadership experience, she won by promising to crack down on eyesores and rule breakers, threatening the community's exclusive character. Her first move after winning? Sending violation notices to anyone who didn't fit her vision of pristine suburban living. The retired couple with a vegetable garden visible from the street. The single mother who couldn't afford professional landscaping. The young family whose swing set was deemed visually disruptive. At the first HOA meeting under her leadership, Patricia singled me out publicly. "I'd like to address a particularly concerning situation," she announced, clicking through a PowerPoint presentation. On screen appeared photos of my property taken with a telephoto lens, my workshop, my restoration projects, my tractor. "This kind of rural eyesore is exactly what drives down our exclusive community values," she announced to the room. "It's frankly embarrassing to have this visible from our prestigious neighborhood." I calmly stood, introduced myself to those who didn't know me, and explained my unique situation. "My property is actually outside HOA jurisdiction," I said, producing my property survey and original HOA agreement. "I've been a good neighbor for 5 years, maintaining my section of road at my own expense, and helping many of you with various projects." Several longtime residents nodded in agreement. They remembered when my property was negotiated. Patricia was visibly flustered by this information she hadn't researched. Her face flushed as murmurs spread through the room. "Well, I'll need to review these documents," she said sharply, snatching the papers from my hand. "In the meantime, I suggest you consider the impact your activities have on our community aesthetics." Small victory. 3 board members requested she review the documents before taking further action. One member, a former real estate lawyer named Barbara, reminded Patricia that pre-existing agreements were legally binding, The meeting moved on to other business, but Patricia's cold stare made it clear this wasn't over. Walking to my truck after the meeting, Barbara approached me. "Watch yourself," she whispered. "Patricia doesn't handle being contradicted well. She's got connections with the county commissioners, and she's not afraid to use them." I thanked her for the warning but wasn't particularly concerned. I had documentation and the law on my side. How much trouble could one person with a power complex cause? I was about to find out. Rather than acknowledging her mistake, Patricia doubled down. A week later, I received a formal letter on HOA letterhead stating that a property consultant had reviewed the community's foundational documents and discovered an overlooked clause from 1982 claiming the HOA had broader authority than previously understood. According to this expert, my driveway wasn't just subject to maintenance fees. It was considered a visual extension of the community, giving the HOA authority to regulate anything visible from it. This conveniently manufactured interpretation would effectively bring my entire front property under HOA control. When I requested to see this clause and the consultant's credentials, Patricia refused, claiming attorney-client privilege and confidentiality concerns. I'd spent decades dealing with contracts and knew this was complete nonsense. I filed a formal records request, exercising my rights as a fee-paying member to access all HOA documents. This small act of resistance triggered something in Patricia. I later learned her previous corporate career had ended after subordinates challenged her decision-making, resulting in a significant financial loss for the company. She'd been pushed into early retirement and apparently saw the HOA presidency as her chance to reclaim authority. The day after filing my request, I discovered my mailbox had been damaged overnight. The security camera I'd installed after Barbara's warning showed a hooded figure approaching at 2 a.m. While I couldn't identify who it was, the timing seemed suspicious. My mailbox began filling with increasingly absurd violation notices: excessive vehicle storage, unauthorized agricultural equipment, improper fixture height, and even mailbox not conforming to community standards. Each notice came with a warning that failure to comply would result in fines, liens, or access restrictions. I responded to each one in writing, attaching copies of my original agreement and requesting a formal hearing as provided in the HOA bylaws. Patricia never acknowledged these responses. Instead, she escalated her campaign. One afternoon, I returned home to find orange violation stickers plastered across my gate and mailbox. My security camera captured Patricia and 2 board members placing them, laughing as they took photos. That evening, I received an email from the HOA's new law firm, a high-priced outfit from the city specializing in community association enforcement. The message threatened legal action if I didn't immediately bring my property into compliance. I sent the entire correspondence to my old friend Carter, who'd been my company's attorney before retiring. His response was immediate. "This is harassment, plain and simple. They're hoping you'll back down to avoid the hassle of fighting. Don't give them an inch." He offered to draft a cease and desist letter pro bono, warning the HOA that their actions constituted harassment and potentially tortious interference. I was reluctant to escalate the situation further but agreed when Carter explained that standing firm now might prevent worse actions later. Patricia's response to the legal letter was to schedule an emergency board vote on security measures for access roads, specifically, installing a gate system that would require resident key cards to enter the community. The obvious implication: I would not be given a key card unless I complied with her demands. I needed to attend that meeting at all costs. This was no longer about principle, it was about maintaining basic access to my home. Patricia began holding emergency HOA meetings scheduled when she knew I'd be at work. The notice for these meetings would arrive in my mailbox the afternoon before, giving me no time to rearrange my schedule. When I requested evening meetings like they'd always had before, she claimed board member availability required daytime sessions. I took a personal day from work to attend the gate system meeting. As I entered the community center, Patricia's expression changed from smug satisfaction to poorly concealed annoyance. She immediately motioned to the board secretary, who shuffled papers and announced a revised agenda that postponed the gate discussion to a future date. When I rose during the public comment period to address the board about the pattern of harassment, Patricia cut my microphone after 30 seconds, citing time constraints. When my neighbor Jacob stood to support me, sharing how I'd helped clear his driveway during the last snowstorm, his microphone was also cut. "We're not here to listen to the Mutual Admiration Society," Patricia snapped. "If you have concerns about HOA actions, submit them in writing through proper channels." This sparked the first visible community division. Several longtime residents walked out in protest. In the parking lot afterward, a small group gathered around me. "This isn't right," said Eleanor, who'd lived in Pine Creek for 20 years. "She's turning our community into her personal fiefdom." Several neighbors approached me privately in the following days, sharing their own problems with Patricia's leadership. Jacob, a retired attorney, offered to review my documents. "I specialized in real estate law," he explained. "Let me see what we're dealing with." Small victory. Jacob discovered Patricia had never properly filed the HOA's updated bylaws with the county, invalidating many of her new rules. Additionally, the original community covenants explicitly stated that properties with pre-existing agreements were grandfathered in and exempt from subsequent rule changes. Jacob helped me draft a formal challenge to the board's actions, citing specific state laws protecting property rights and HOA members' rights to due process. We submitted this document to the entire board, requesting it be added to the next meeting's agenda. When that meeting arrived, Patricia refused to acknowledge the challenge. When Jacob attempted to raise it during public comments, she had security, a new addition to meetings, remove him for disruptive behavior. The room erupted in shouting, half supporting Patricia's vision for community excellence, half outraged at her tactics. "Order!" Patricia shouted, banging her gavel. "Anyone who cannot conduct themselves appropriately will be removed and banned from future meetings." That night, my security cameras recorded Patricia slowly driving by my property, taking photos with a flash. The next morning, I found a final notice taped to my gate. "Compliance required within 48 hours or enforcement actions will commence." I called Jacob immediately. "What enforcement actions can they legally take?" "Technically, very little," he said. "They can fine you, but they can't enforce those fines without a court order. They can't legally restrict your access without cause." But what? Patricia doesn't strike me as someone who cares about what's legal. She cares about what she can get away with. His words proved prophetic sooner than either of us expected. 3 days later, I woke at 5 a.m. to the sound of heavy equipment. Through my window, I watched in disbelief as a dump truck unloaded hundreds of used tires across my driveway entrance. Patricia stood supervising in her business suit and heels, arms crossed, directing the placement to ensure maximum blockage. I grabbed my phone and rushed outside in my bathrobe, recording everything. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted, approaching the barricade. Patricia turned, her expression a mix of surprise and smug satisfaction at seeing my distress. "Good morning, Mr. Donovan. I see you're finally awake to address your compliance issues." "This is illegal," I said, pointing to the wall of tires now completely blocking my access road. "You can't imprison me on my own property." Patricia smiled coldly. "Your property might be outside our jurisdiction, but this access road isn't. Consider your driveway privileges revoked until you comply with community standards." She handed me an envelope containing a list of 27 violations and walked away as I stood speechless. "You have my number when you're ready to cooperate," she called over her shoulder, climbing into her luxury SUV. "Until then, I'd suggest finding alternative transportation." The camera on my workshop captured this entire confrontation. The exact scene shown in the thumbnail, with Patricia gesturing triumphantly toward the tire barricade while I stood in shock. I immediately called the county sheriff's office. The dispatcher sounded skeptical but promised to send a deputy. While waiting, I examined the tire barricade more closely. It contained hundreds of tires of various sizes, many still containing water and debris, creating not just a physical barrier but a potential health hazard. When Deputy Collins arrived, he surveyed the scene with a frown. "This doesn't look right," he admitted. "But HOA disputes are civil matters. We can't intervene without a court order." "This isn't a dispute," I argued. It's imprisonment and illegal dumping. The deputy took photos and made notes but ultimately shook his head. My hands are tied. You'll need to contact an attorney and file for an emergency injunction. After he left, I called every towing company in the county. None would help after hearing the address. Sorry, sir, one operator explained. We received a cease and desist letter from Pine Creek HOA's attorneys warning us not to interfere with their official community safety measures. I was effectively trapped. My truck was parked on the other side of the barricade, and I had a critical doctor's appointment that afternoon. I called the medical office to explain my situation. Mr. Donovan, the nurse said, Dr. Matthews is very concerned about your heart condition. You can't miss this follow-up. Is there any way you can get here? I had no choice but to walk. I grabbed my medications and hiked nearly 2 miles through neighboring properties, climbing over fences and crossing fields to reach the main road. I arrived at the doctor's office sweaty, exhausted, and 40 minutes late. Dr. Matthews was alarmed by my blood pressure readings. Jim, what's going on? These numbers are dangerously high. When I explained the situation, she was incredulous. They can't do that, she exclaimed. That's elder abuse and a medical emergency. I'm documenting this in your records. As I left the appointment, I saw Patricia in the parking lot, watching me from her car. She'd followed me to verify I couldn't use my vehicle. Our eyes met briefly before she drove away. This wasn't just about control anymore, it felt personal. And it was about to get worse. The barricade created immediate problems far beyond inconvenience. I couldn't get my truck out, which meant I couldn't get to work. I called my boss to explain the situation, sending photos of the tire wall. Jesus, Jim, he said, that's insane. Take a couple days to sort it out, but we've got the Henderson project starting next week. I need you on site. I had medication deliveries that couldn't reach me. My propane tank was running low, and the delivery truck couldn't get through. As a heart patient, being cut off from emergency services was particularly concerning. I contacted the County Environmental Protection Office about the tires, explaining the potential for mosquito breeding and water contamination. They were more responsive than the sheriff, sending an inspector who issued a citation, not to Patricia or the HOA, but to me as the property owner where the tires were dumped. This is outrageous, I told the inspector. I didn't put these tires here. I understand, sir, he replied awkwardly. But they're on your driveway entrance, which is technically your responsibility to maintain. You'll need to provide evidence of who dumped them for us to redirect the citation. I showed him my security footage of Patricia directing the dump truck. He looked uncomfortable. I'll note this in my report, but you'll still need to address the environmental hazard. That afternoon, I missed my weekly heart checkup. Walking across the fields again wasn't an option. My morning trek had left me exhausted and in pain. I called Dr. Matthews, who was deeply concerned. Jim, with your condition, stress like this could trigger a serious cardiac event. Your blood pressure is already dangerously elevated. I'm going to adjust your medication, but what you really need is to resolve this situation. She documented the medical impact of Patricia's actions, providing official medical records detailing how the barricade was affecting my health. If you need me to testify that this is creating a medical emergency, I will, she offered. My daily routine became a nightmare. I had to park my second vehicle, an old pickup truck I was restoring, at a shopping center a mile away and walk back and forth. I couldn't get deliveries. Friends couldn't visit. The isolation was taking a psychological toll. Each night, I'd sit on my porch looking at the wall of tires blocking my freedom. My doctor's warning about stress-induced cardiac events echoed in my mind. At 62, with a history of heart problems, this situation wasn't just infuriating, it was potentially life-threatening. Small victory. Dr. Matthews was so disturbed by my situation that she prepared a formal medical letter stating that the barricade created an imminent health risk to a cardiac patient by preventing emergency medical access and causing dangerous levels of stress. She sent copies to the HOA board, the county commissioner's office, and my file. If anything happens to you because of this, she told me firmly, there will be a clear record of medical warning that was ignored. I attempted one final peaceful resolution, requesting a mediation session with the entire board present. To my surprise, Patricia agreed, seeming confident in her position. The meeting was set for the community center the following afternoon. I prepared meticulously, bringing all my documentation: property surveys, the original HOA agreement, medical records, security footage, and the environmental citation. Jacob agreed to accompany me as an advisor. Patricia arrived flanked by 2 board members and a young attorney from her high-priced law firm. She brought enlarged photos of my property, dramatically pointing out each eyesore to the gathered board members. "This is what we're dealing with," she announced, showing images of my classic car restoration projects: junk vehicles, unsightly equipment, an industrial workshop in a residential community. Property values in the eastern section have already dropped 3% because of this eyesore. When it was my turn, I calmly presented evidence that her actions violated county access laws, environmental regulations, and medical safety codes. The board members shifted uncomfortably as I showed them Dr. Matthews' letter warning of potential health consequences. "This isn't just about aesthetics," I explained. "This is about safety, legality, and basic human decency." Patricia's attorney attempted to dismiss these concerns as emotional appeals irrelevant to covenant enforcement, but even he seemed unsettled by the medical documentation. As the discussion continued, Patricia became increasingly agitated. When one board member suggested a compromise, she slammed her hand on the table. "There will be no compromise with rule breakers," she snapped. Then, glaring directly at me, she revealed her true motivation. "I built my career destroying men who thought they were above following directions from a woman in charge. You're no different. Just another stubborn old man who needs to learn his place in the modern world." The room fell silent. Even her supporters seemed uncomfortable with this admission. The young attorney whispered something in her ear, but she brushed him off. Small victory. 3 board members exchanged concerned glances, with one quietly leaving the room to make a phone call. When he returned, he suggested tabling further discussion until their attorney could review all the documentation. "This situation has clearly escalated beyond what any of us anticipated," he said carefully. "I move that we restore Mr. Donovan's access pending legal review." Patricia overruled him immediately. "As president, I have emergency powers to maintain community standards. The barricade stays until full compliance is achieved." As I left the meeting, one board member whispered, "She's gone too far this time. Give us a few days to handle this internally." But I had already waited too long. 2 weeks into this nightmare, I was effectively imprisoned on my own property. I'd been sleeping in my old pickup parked off-site and showering at the gym just to maintain my job. My restoration projects, including a 1967 Mustang I'd promised to finish for my grandson's graduation, sat untouched. The physical toll was becoming unbearable. My blood pressure remained dangerously high despite increased medication. I developed insomnia, often sitting up all night watching my security cameras, half expecting Patricia to escalate further. The isolation was perhaps worst of all. I'd always been independent, but being forcibly cut off from the world was different. Simple tasks like grocery shopping became logistical challenges. Friends stopped visiting because of the difficult access. That evening, my daughter Emily called for our weekly check-in. I'd been hiding the situation to avoid worrying her. She was finishing her medical residency across the country and had enough stress. "How's everything, Dad?" she asked cheerfully. "Fine, sweetheart. Just working on the usual projects." My voice must have betrayed me. "Dad," she said, her tone changing immediately. "What's wrong? You sound terrible." I tried deflecting, mentioning a minor cold, but Emily had inherited my stubborn streak. "I'm a doctor, remember? I can tell when someone's not telling me the truth about their health. What's going on?" Finally, I broke down, explaining everything: the harassment, the barricade, the medical concerns, the isolation. As I spoke, the emotional weight I'd been carrying alone suddenly felt overwhelming. "Dad, this is insane. Why didn't you tell me? Have you called Uncle Michael?" she asked. "I can't bother your uncle with this. He's got important work. Dad, she interrupted, her voice sharp with concern. Call Uncle Michael. Now, this isn't about pride, it's about your health and safety. Promise me you'll call him tonight. Small victory. Finally acknowledging I couldn't solve this alone was surprisingly liberating. Okay, I'll call him. Tonight, she insisted. I want you to call him while we're still on the phone. After we hung up, I sat staring at Michael's contact information on my phone. I hadn't asked my younger brother for help since our parents passed. We'd always been close but took different paths in life. While I built things with my hands, Michael built a career in law that had taken him to remarkable heights. Heights I'd always been proud of but reluctant to impose upon. I took a deep breath and dialed his number. Michael answered on the second ring. Jim? Everything okay? It's not like you to call this late. I'm sorry to bother you, Mike. I've got a situation here. I began hesitantly. You never bother me, big brother. What's going on? I explained everything: Patricia's harassment campaign, the tire barricade, the medical concerns, the failed attempts at resolution. Michael listened silently, not interrupting once. When I finished, the line was quiet for so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Mike, you still there? I'm here, he replied, his voice measured, almost unnervingly calm. I need you to send me everything: photos, documents, recordings. Every communication with this HOA and Patricia. Every medical record related to this situation. Don't leave anything out. I can do that, but what? Don't touch anything at the barricade, he continued. Don't remove a single tire. Don't engage with Patricia or anyone from the HOA. Document everything, but take no action. His tone reminded me of our father, deliberate, authoritative, with an edge of controlled anger. I'll be there tomorrow morning, he said. Have everything ready. Mike, you don't need to come. You've got important work. Jim, he interrupted. There are different kinds of important. This is family. Nothing takes priority over that. In all our years, I'd rarely heard Michael speak with such intensity. He'd always been the measured one, the diplomatic counterbalance to my more direct approach. Thank you, I said simply. Get some rest, brother. Things will look different tomorrow. After we hung up, I felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. Michael would help, but what exactly did that mean? Michael arrived at 7 a.m. sharp in his black government sedan, dressed not in judicial robes but an impeccable dark suit that screamed authority. He embraced me briefly, then immediately shifted to business. Show me everything, he said. We walked the property boundary together. Michael silently surveyed the tire barricade, taking photos and making notes. His expression remained neutral, but I recognized the slight tightening around his eyes, the same look he'd had as a child when neighborhood bullies targeted smaller kids. You filmed her doing this? He asked, pointing to my security camera. Yes, got the whole thing. Her directing the truck, the dumping, our confrontation afterward. Perfect. He reviewed the footage on my laptop, making occasional notes. Then he made 3 brief phone calls, speaking in legal terminology I barely understood. I caught fragments: immediate environmental hazard, denial of emergency access, potential civil rights violation. Within an hour, 3 vehicles arrived simultaneously. The county sheriff, a professional removal team, and Patricia Harmon herself, who had apparently received a call from someone. Patricia stormed toward us in the same business suit from the barricade day. What do you think you're doing? This is HOA property and these... She froze mid-sentence as Michael turned to face her, recognition slowly dawning on her face. Her confidence visibly faltered as she looked between us, finally registering the family resemblance. Who are you? She demanded, though her voice had lost its edge. Michael stepped forward, extending his business card. As Patricia took it, her face drained of color. Oh my God, she whispered, finally understanding the depths of her miscalculation. Ms. Harmon, Michael said calmly. I'm Federal Judge Michael Donovan. Perhaps you've heard of Harrington versus Lakeside HOA? Or Wilkins versus Mountain Creek Estates? both landmark cases establishing that restricting access to a private residence constitutes false imprisonment under federal law. The sheriff, who clearly knew my brother by reputation, nodded respectfully. Judge Donovan, we've secured the scene as requested. Environmental protection is en route regarding the illegal tire dumping. Patricia's hand trembled slightly as she held Michael's business card. I wasn't aware. That James Donovan is my brother. Michael finished her sentence. You also weren't aware that using HOA funds to pursue personal vendettas constitutes breach of fiduciary duty, or that your unauthorized environmental dump violates 7 different federal statutes. He handed her a document. This is a formal notice of investigation into Pine Creek Estate's HOA governance practices, financial records, and your personal actions in this matter. The sheriff has a separate notice regarding criminal charges of false imprisonment and environmental violations. Patricia attempted to regain her composure. Our attorneys will— Your attorneys, Michael interrupted calmly, will advise you to cooperate fully. Morgan & Winters is an excellent firm, but they won't risk their reputation defending actions this egregious, particularly once they review the full evidence, including your statement that this was personally motivated. He turned to the sheriff. Please ensure Ms. Harmon remains available while we process the scene. And could you please contact the district attorney? I believe they'll want to review this case personally. Patricia stood speechless as the removal team began dismantling the tire barricade. Neighbors emerged from their homes, watching in disbelief as the wall that had symbolized Patricia's unchecked authority came down piece by piece. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe freely. Within hours, the tire barricade disappeared. The removal company, under environmental oversight, properly disposed of all tires at the HOA's expense. By afternoon, my driveway was clear again. Within days, Patricia resigned from the HOA board. Her resignation letter cited personal reasons, but everyone knew the truth. 3 other board members who had enabled her tactics stepped down as a forensic audit revealed years of financial irregularities predating Patricia's leadership. Within a week, an emergency community meeting was called. My neighbor Jacob was elected interim president, immediately implementing transparency measures and restoring original property agreements. At his request, Michael helped draft new HOA bylaws that protected both community standards and individual property rights, a model later adopted by neighborhoods across the county. The county commissioner's office, suddenly very attentive to our community's concerns, fast-tracked approval for these changes. The environmental citation against me was rescinded and properly reassigned to the responsible parties. Patricia listed her house for sale the following month. As she supervised the movers, I approached her fence with a peace offering, a potted plant for her new home. No hard feelings, I said, extending the gift. Everyone deserves a fresh start. She looked at me for a long moment before accepting it with a nod, a small acknowledgement that perhaps we both had learned something. Good luck, I said, turning to leave. Mr. Donovan, she called after me. Your brother, he's a formidable man. I smiled. You have no idea. Sometimes justice wears unexpected faces. The tire barricade meant to isolate me ended up building a stronger community instead. My brother didn't just solve my problem. He helped restore principles of fairness and respect that benefit everyone. Now when I drive down my clear driveway each morning, I'm reminded that standing up for what's right isn't about winning battles. It's about setting precedents that protect us all.